Hello, welcome to the Mystic Chat. And today we have the fabulous Kelden, and we'll introduce him in a minute. But first, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Chris Allen. I am a published author. I am also an ordained minister with the Fellowship of the Phoenix, and I do all kinds of other things too. So we're going to have some fun today. I would like to introduce my co-host, Aaron. Aaron, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Aaron Marsh, and I am also a mentor with the Fellowship of the Phoenix. I'm a witch and ceremonial magician, and by day a pastry chef now in Houston, Texas. I'm super excited. We have author Kelden, who wrote The Crooked Path and The Witches Sabbath. And tell us more about yourself, Kelden.
Hello, I'm Kelden. Yes, I am a traditional witch. Daytime-wise, I'm a mental health therapist. I've written 2 books, The Crooked Path, An Introduction to Traditional Witchcraft, and my newest book, The Witches Sabbath, An Exploration of History, Folklore, and Modern Practice. That's me.
You're so funny. Welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you. A lot of people who know my practice, I have been a traditional witch since 2002. And Aaron, I want to say 2013, is that right? 2013, 2014 for you? And then, yeah. So it's interesting because, I read both of your books, and the Witches Sabbath is something that really grabbed my attention. The reason is that we talk about it in the folklore, it is an actual thing. And we don't write about it so much. I don't really talk about it per se and things like that. And the only reason is because I found that a lot of people, and I actually posted something this on my Twitter just to be irritating to people, but I found that a lot of people who don't understand advanced magical practices, they think it's fake. So I normally don't talk about the Witches Sabbath, not because it's secret or anything like that. It's because people don't believe it's a thing. So can you talk about that just a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that this sort of extends broadly into magical practice in general, but I think the more we approach specific topics around like working with spirits, working with the other world, and the Sabbath being a part of that, there's a tendency to be very hesitant to talk about our experiences, especially in very public ways, because there's that worry that are people gonna judge us in certain ways, like view it as like, you're making that up, that's not real, you're crazy. Sometimes we maybe have those doubts kind of within ourselves that maybe we're projecting outward. Whether like, is this real? Did I really experience this? And I think that's unfortunate because there is such a wealth of knowledge and experience that we could potentially share with each other, or that maybe that we're yearning to share with other people, but we're sort of afraid of how we're going to be viewed. And certainly, I mean, a lot of these things do seem very fantastical, and I mean, really, that's because they are. Things that I say a lot, about being a witch, and it's something that is said a lot, or that's pointed out a lot, is how witches are often, we're people who stand with one foot in this world and one foot in the other world, right? We're liminal people. And part of that liminality is also the space between fantasy and reality. And I think it's part of our innate ability as witches to take the fantastical and to make that reality and to engage in these realms that are fantastical. I think that's part of our innate power.
Aaron, I know you have questions, because he was just saying, "Oh, I'm so excited about this, blah 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 blah." So, question.
Yeah, I do. You have, in fact, you started to address one of them. So you mentioned how sometimes the voice of the voice of doubt is our own and being projected, and I know that can be limiting in letting ourselves experience the Sabbath. Can you speak a little bit more about that, and maybe if you have any suggestions on dealing with our own placing our own limitations on ourselves?
The first thing that pops into my mind is how often we go into things with very overblown expectations. I come across this a lot when when talking to other people about spirit flight or hedge crossing, and again, attending the Sabbath is part of that. And we tend to have these high expectations of what that's going to be like, what that's going to look like. And if it doesn't match that, then we sort of doubt. We look at it like, oh, well, I can't do that. And it's interesting because a lot of times when I sort of break down that and I sort of parse out for people how really these things are a lot less, those high, basically just breaking down those high expectations and talking about the reality of what these things are like. People are often like, oh, well, yeah, I've done that. And so a lot of times we've already done these things without even realizing it. We've already traveled into the other world. We've maybe already attended the Sabbath. We just didn't realize it because it wasn't matching up to that high expectation we had. And so I think my biggest advice is looking at, like, what are your preconceived notions about spirit flight, about the other world, about the Witches Sabbath? I mean, I would say by and large, people often expect that they're going to have this super vivid, super intense experience where their spirit becomes completely detached from their physical body. They're going to be engaging in a realm that looks, that is very vivid in the sense that we are experiencing our physical surroundings right now, that it's going to be exactly that, but in this other realm. And that's just not the case. It's not to say that we can't have vivid and powerful experiences, but it's not going to be the same as how we experience things in the physical realm. And I think when we can let that go, that's when we start to really step into our power and into those experiences, and we can really fully engage with them.
I'm realizing we kind of jumped in. We were excited to talk about this, and I think we kind of jumped in mid-discussion. We should give you a chance to explain what the Witches Sabbath is historically and your book.
Yeah. So the Witches Sabbath is a concept that really develops over time and really kind of in the early modern period forward. And it's this idea that witches gather in the dead of night. They come together and they meet with the devil and they work spells and they engage in these different activities. They feast and they dance and they have sex and all of this stuff happens, and it's quite sensational. And this concept develops over a long period of time, and then it enters into the witch trials as those reach their height. And then after that, it survives into popular folklore. And then, through extension of that, it seeps into with the rise of modern witchcraft, with the modern witchcraft revival. And it takes these different forms. I think a lot of times, if someone were to bring up the Witches Sabbath, right, from a sort of modern perspective, especially if you're operating in sort of a broader, like, neo-pagan or Wiccan perspective, you're going to think of the Wheel of Year. You're going to think of these seasonal holidays. And that does come out of this long sort of chain of events, but, really that's inspired by this original folklore of these gatherings of witches and the devil. And it's that it stays true to that folklore in a lot of branches witchcraft, and largely what we would look at as traditional witchcraft, that it's not so much these seasonal holidays that are marking the change in seasonal tides, or perhaps operating as sort of a narrative, a metaphorical narrative of a god and a goddess. It still is this otherworldly event that we attend, and we go and we meet with spirits and we make pacts and we work magic and engage in these different activities. So yeah, I guess in some that's sort of the quick notes version of the Witches Sabbath.
So yes, let me finish this thought because I have a question. I'm so excited. So in our tradition, in me and Aaron's tradition, the Witches Sabbath isn't got a time or a place. It's an in between, and it's happening all the time because, as you well know, in the other world there is no time and place, and so you can join the Sabbath whenever you choose. However, again, in my tradition, we teach that on certain days of power, it's easier to find everyone, like a witchy GPS, like on the full moon or the dark moon, or on Samhain and Beltane and things like that. So I'm wondering, how do you see it? Do you see it as whoever shows up and it is what it is? Or do you feel like it's just a conglomerate of, it's a thing in the other world that you can come and go as you please? Or how do you view it yourself?
Yeah, so this is where I'll admit, this is where I think it starts to get tricky. And to be honest, I stop asking questions and I'm just like, you know what? It is what it is. And maybe some people might find that uninspiring, but it's sort of how I feel about the afterlife in general, where I'm like, you know what? It is what it is, and we'll figure it out. But yeah, I mean, because this question comes up because people will kind of think about, well, like if I go to the Sabbath, if I go to this otherworldly meeting, like, am I going to see people I know there? Like, are we going to meet all together in this place? And well, I think that's possible. And there are certain ways to maybe achieve that. I mean, I think in some ways we all experience the other world differently. Like, and I think that's just sort of the way it unfolds. I guess maybe I don't know how to explain it fully, or I don't have succinct words for it. But I like what you said. I mean, it is this ongoing, ever-present space within the other world, the Sabbath. I mean, we could go to it any time, but yes, there are maybe certain days where it's more auspicious or more, it's easier to access in some ways or find. But I do think it's an ongoing event in the other worlds.
I wanted to ask, what was your inspiration to do the Witches Sabbath? Were you inspired, or how did that come to be?
Like, how did the book come to be?
Yeah, like, why did you write the book?
So essentially, I mean, this book is my love letter to the Witches Sabbath and craft. And sort of a few things came up. One is that you have this section in here about the Witches Sabbath, and it's really great. It's got a lot of really cool information, but it's really dense in comparison to other sections. Can you cut it down? And I was like, cut it down? Like, what? How could I possibly do that? And then I was like, you know what? I'll just write a whole book on it. Like, I'll just give it its own book, because it really warrants its own volume. But the other big inspiration behind it is that, it's not to say that the Witches Sabbath in this otherworldly context isn't talked about, but I don't think it's talked about nearly enough. And I think that's a shame. I think that even when it comes to like the Wheel of Year, I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with how that concept even came to be. I think a lot of times we sort of look immediately to like, oh, well, like the ancient Celts had these solstices and equinoxes have always sort of been celebrated. And I think we miss that piece about like, okay, there is that, but there's also the fact that, I mean, this comes out of witch trial folklore. The other thing too is that a lot of this history and information about the Sabbath and how it's developed is often only talked about in academic texts, in academic spaces. And these are texts that are often inaccessible to people, both in terms of like price. I mean, a lot of these are really expensive, but also language. They're written using academic language that is just not really fun to read. And it can be really difficult to read. These are also books that are typically not being sought out or found because they're not, as modern practitioners, we're not going to find these books in, like in our section of Barnes and Noble or, whatever bookstore. These are books that are going to be found in history sections and anthropology sections. And so if we're not aware of that, we're not going to find them. And so I really wanted to help bridge that gap between academia and modern practice, because that's the other piece of it too. When it comes to the scholarship done on the Witches Sabbath, there's this sort of stopping point that happens. So with the start of the Age of Enlightenment and the decline in witch trials, scholars sort of stop. Any conversations about the Witches Sabbath sort of stop there. It's, like, this is the end. Like, that's not really a thing anymore. People stop believing in the reality of witchcraft. So they stop believing in the reality of the Witches Sabbath. Like, yes, it sort of survives in popular folklore, but it's just folklore. And there's not really much look at like how that concept survives and then is revitalized with the modern witchcraft revival, right? That there's still a historical development to this concept that happens beyond the end of the witch trials.
Cool. I mean, yeah, you answered a whole lot. I'm just like, that's good, because like in my own research, just for my own gratification and things, you have to piece things together. And one of the things that really impressed me about your book, and I have to tell you, it takes a lot to impress me for a traditional witchcraft book, because a lot of them are just very basic, because they're either they don't know the lore or they're afraid to reveal secrets. I'm like, reveal the secrets, it's all online anyway. It's true, right? But I was very impressed about your research. I thought it was very well researched. I thought it was very well said. You kind of have a similar style that I have, in the sense of you take something very heady and academic and speak to it like you're speaking to your friend or a student or someone like that. So I have to tell you, the first thing is because I was like, oh, let me try this book out. Let me see. In the first few chapters about all the research, I was like, okay, I'm sold. I'm here, because you had me at research.
It's my favorite word.
It is my favorite word too. What are you thinking, Aaron?
The same, actually. I had a really similar experience when I began the book, was that I was so impressed at the level of research and the quality of the citations, and yet how accessible and fun of a book it is to read. And then on top of that, there's recipes. So you get to the middle of the book and there's a whole ton of recipes.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I can't recommend it enough. I really enjoyed it.
So I want to talk about your traditional witchcraft experience, because every time I talk to someone, it's very unique for everybody. So I'm wondering what your journey into tradcraft is.
Mm-hmm. So I would say that, like, really it starts in childhood, because it's sort of it's sort of like a return to home sort of narrative, in the sense that witchcraft has always very much been a part of my life. I grew up really, really into witches. I mean, even from like the age of like 4, like I just always gravitated towards witches, stories about witches. Like it's just always been a part of my life. And I spent a lot of my childhood outside. I mean, I grew up in the country, and you know, it was very much that sort of generation and place too, where it's like, you know, you play outside all day. Your parents are just like, okay, you go outside and you don't come back until, you know, until dark. So spending a lot of time in the woods next to my house, I mean, this was the place where I would first encounter spirits. I would work with the fair folk. They were my friends. I'd build houses for them, and I'd pick plants and cast spells. And it was very much a part of my reality, this sort of fantastical, again, this fantastical realm. And when I was in 5th grade, so kind of age 11, is when I discovered Wicca. And this was through the wonders of the internet. And it was just this really mind-blowing moment in my life where I was like, there are other people. Like, there are other people. And it's not that I doubted the reality of what I was doing, but it was just that I suddenly wasn't alone. And I remember I had found this, it was like a GeoCities website. You know, so it had like the spinning silver sparkly like adornments and the panpipe music playing in the background that you couldn't figure out how to shut off, but you sort of kind of liked it anyways. And I just ate up all of the information on this website. I mean, they broke down like, you know, like the basic beliefs of Wicca and like the common misconceptions and, you know, the different tools. And I went to town. I immediately set about trying to like find these tools and set up an altar. And I was really lucky. I mean, I had very supportive parents. I mean, they had already I'd already been into witches for so long that it wasn't like this big shocking thing. They, you know, they bought me my first books, you know, and it really started from there. I got very into Wicca, and it just kind of grew from there. And it wasn't until I was in undergrad, so when I started college, that I really started to kind of question things. I started to feel dissatisfied with a lot of the books I was reading. You know, as my own critical thinking skills grew, I started to ask a lot of questions around like, okay, well, like these books often talk about this sort of history of where like witchcraft comes from. But like, these things have been disproven. Like this isn't accurate. Like, why are we still telling these stories? Why are we doing these things, right? Where do these things come from? And so this is where my research started. And I started reading the books by the pioneers of Wicca. I started reading Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente. I started taking a lot of notes and looking at like, okay, where are these things? Yeah, like where are these things coming from? We do these things, but why? And so I'd read one book and then I'd take their bibliography or their recommended reading and I'd read those books. And it was during this time that I discovered, like, one is I discovered there's a whole lot more to Wicca than what is commonly put out there. So I sort of, you know, discovered that I had this deep respect for Wicca, but I was finding that like it wasn't for me. And it was at this time that I discovered like there's this whole other branch to this tree of witchcraft, this whole other giant trunk, this path. And it's traditional witchcraft. And so this largely was found because of Doreen's writings about working with Robert Cochrane. And I'm like, who's this guy? I started reading this stuff. And it just felt a lot more at home. And really what it did is it connected me back to that early childhood, to those experiences of working very closely with nature, with a craft that's very intuitive, very practical, very land-based, very spirit-based. And so it was this sort of return to home, and that's been the journey ever since.
That's actually very similar to my journey. I'm from Texas, in a small like farm town, and I used to play in the woods all the time and see things and hear things. And where my story is a little bit different is that my aunt used to do seances and would tell us stories at bedtime. It's like, once upon a time, we summoned a man who hung himself. Good night. And so between the two, that's how I became, into it. Aaron, what was your draw into tradcraft?
So yeah, my experience was very different. I grew up in Chicago. And my first experience with witchcraft was through books. And the first one, I don't know what it was. I went to the library, and it was around Halloween. So everything was checked out except for there was like 6 copies of one specific book. And that was all that was left. And so I said, okay, I'll take that one. And then it was never at the Chicago Public Library again after that. So I don't remember what it was. The next book was from my college library, and that was Starhawk Spiral Dance. And that was influential. I was practicing. I did not know about reclaiming, but I was just practicing solitary, what I was learning from Spiral Dance, until I joined the Fellowship. I believe, yeah, the Fellowship of the Phoenix, which had 3 branches of influence, which was neo-paganism, ceremonial magic, and traditional witchcraft. And then, I enjoyed the traditional witchcraft branch of that.
Yeah. One of the things that I remember, on my journey, yes, just like everyone else, Wicca is like a gateway drug into all the other traditions. It's like, here, smoke this. You won't get addicted. I'm like, Wicca. It's like the marijuana of the magical world. But I agree with the whole flowery, and I say flowery because it is. It's like, oh, it's the mother goddess, and she loves all things and flowers and sunshine and blah blah blah. And then how I was even initiated into traditional craft is that I started to see more ghosts and became more spirits. And so one of my teachers was just like, they're talking to you and they want you to answer. And in fact, just for fun, he was just like, here's this. He didn't tell me it was a sting. He was like, here's a stick. Tell me about it. This is the devil. This is what it's for. Blah, blah, blah. This is also, you can use this as a broom, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, how do I know this? He was like, yeah, how do you know that? I'm like, But anyway, so for me, it was more about just gravitating towards the energies and things like that. So I want to talk about the devil. Tell me about the devil, and why is it called the devil, and why it's such a controversial word.
So this is a very contentious topic, and I love discussing it. So, gosh, it's like hard to even think about like where to start. So I think, okay, so maybe starting with why. Why is this controversial? So I think it's a very common experience, that people are very quick to say, like, there's no devil in witchcraft. There's no devil in witchcraft. That's not a thing. That's a Christian concept. We're not Christian. It's not part of it. And I certainly think that it's true that like the devil is not a part of many people's witchcraft. But I think that is not true for all. And I don't think that's true in terms of history and folklore. So I want to take a step back to like the early days of the modern witchcraft revival. So mid 20th century, right? The last of the witchcraft acts in England are repealed. It's people can now publicly be witches without facing fines or possible imprisonment. We have people like Gerald Gardner coming forth publicly and being like, I'm a witch, there's witches, we've been here all along, we're doing things. And there's sort of this vibe for public attention and public acceptance. And a big part of that is trying to dismiss people's fear. And so as an extension of that, it's to say, well, we don't work with the devil. That's not a thing. We're not here to harm anyone. We're not evil. We're not scary. We're just people. And in a lot of ways that makes sense, right? Because if you want public acceptance, part of that is showing people that you're safe, that you meet whatever societal standards there are. I will say part of the problem of this is witchcraft is never meant to be publicly acceptable, because it's transgressive. It's I think I sort of personally kind of cringe at the idea of witchcraft being publicly acceptable. But again, it makes sense, because especially as we move forward in time, when we move into the 80s and the 90s, we're having the satanic panic. And there are still repercussions for people. There's still harm that can come your way for being a witch. And so it makes sense that you want to separate yourself from the ooky spooky. So I mean, it makes sense. It's been beaten into our heads. There's no devil in the craft. But now when we stretch further back, when we look at history and we look at folklore, and one of the things that, I've recently said very publicly, and I definitely made a lot of people unhappy, is that witchcraft itself comes out of and in response to Christianity. And a lot of people really don't like that because they want to believe in this version of history. And I wanted to take a moment to say that I'm not trying to say that the figure of the witch necessarily didn't exist before Christianity, or that magical practice didn't exist before Christianity, because a lot of times people conflate magical practice with witchcraft, and we know that there are many magical practices that are not witchcraft. So this is very nuanced, and I'm trying to keep all of the threads together. So when we look back at the development of the figure of the witch, of witchcraft, we don't see witches working necessarily with pagan deities like we would today. We don't see witches working with Pan or Herne. We see witches working with the devil. And yeah, sometimes we see, certain spirits being brought up. I mean, we see names like Diana being dropped occasionally. But we're not seeing witches working with, different pagan deities. We're seeing them working with the devil. And so we can't necessarily ignore that. Now, I think that it is true that any sort of deity, spirit, whatever that was not the Christian God was very quickly labeled the devil or a demon. And so I think a lot of these spirits, they came to be lumped under this header. And in that sense, those spirits then survive into popular folklore. And this is where we start to see this difference, right? And people make this difference between the theological devil and the folkloric devil. And the folkloric devil is this character that we find in these stories, in these sort of fairy tales and fables. And it's a very different sort of figure than what we would find in sort of a biblical sense. He's this folk character who tests people and plays tricks, but who also shapes the very landscape itself. We see this, I mean, we can just look around, even now, we see all the natural landscape places that are named, like Devil's Kettle, Devil's Lake, Devil's Punch Bowl. I mean, the idea is that the devil is the land, is shaping the land. So I think, when it comes to traditional witchcraft, the devil, and this is going to vary, of course, from person to person. It's also going to vary on how you view spirits and deities and things like that. So I'll just speak from my perspective, is that I view the devil really as a amalgamation of different spirits that sort of come together and form this deity. And really, the devil is sort of a title. It's sort of a placeholder. And I guess just the last thing I'll say, because I know I'm kind of going on long here, is people have often asked me, well, why would you use the term devil? Like, why? Like, if you're seeing this as like maybe like a sort of amalgamation of different spirits and deities, why would you use this word to describe them that is so negative or controversial? And to that, I always point out, well, why do we use the term witch? That was not, the term witch was never a positive term until modern times. It was not something that you would want to be called, but we've reclaimed it. We've tapped into that transgressive spirit of the witch, and we've claimed it. And I think we do the same thing with the term devil. And because there's sort of this idea, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily historical fact, but this idea that, as Christianity was rising, in these spirits, they were taking these spirits and they were sort of labeling them devils and handing them back to the people, is that the people sort of said, okay, well then this is our devil and we're just going to run with it. In fact, there's an interesting particular theory put forth by a number of like scholars and historians that are largely debunked. I mean, we know that this isn't necessarily, again, true, but this idea that exactly that is that the sort of peasant class people in different areas, as Christianity took hold, they were like, oh, well, you're practicing this paganism, this is Satanism. And so then they just threw up their hands and said, okay, then we're Satanists. Again, not historical fact, but it's still an idea, and I think we're doing that today.
Right. Everything you said is exactly what I teach to my a tradcraft circle and people who read my books, like everything. We say the horned one who has, the witch father who has hooves and horns, but don't say devil because that's a bad word, and you hit it on the head. The reason we use the term witch is because it makes us feel powerful. I don't care who you are. If you say the term witch does not make you feel powerful, you are fooling yourself. Mm-hmm. Because, and I can't stress this enough, if you do your research, which you have, I can see that the term witch comes from the Middle Ages. It is not an ancient pagan word. As you said, there are magical people and shamans and things like that. Like Medea, she was never called a witch. Never. That is a modern translation. She was a magical person. Interesting, because on my first book, Underworld, I talk about the Goes, is where we get the word Goetia. And the Goes are Greek, and they're Greek necromancers, and their job was to raise the dead. But you think of traditional witchcraft, like you raise the dead, and they honored Hades and Persephone, but not how you think. And so these were people who were honored, but you didn't hang out with them because you're like, man, if you're conjuring out the dead, what the hell else are you going to do?
Right. Exactly. And that's, yes. So we often retroactively look at people from different times and cultures and we label them as witches. And that's really a large disservice because those people had their own terms that they were using.
Right. That's
And
right.
that's an important nuance. And the other thing too is even those magical practitioners or the people that maybe would be close to what we'd call a witch today still weren't accepted. I think a lot of times people look at places like pagan, like Greece and Rome, and they go, oh, well, back then, you know, but you're conflating things. You're conflating paganism with witchcraft. You're conflating pagan priests and priestesses with witches.
Right.
Even back then, those people that you know, that would be close to what we call witch state, were still persecuted. They were still looked upon suspiciously. They were still looked upon as, you know, being malignant. So again, like, it's not that, you know, again, that being a witch was this positive thing. Like that, again, it's not until recent time.
Well, you know, the thing is that, you know, when Christianity really came into power, like really came into power, wasn't until like 800, 900 CE. And yes, it's true. Anyone who didn't honor Jesus was considered a witch. So if you were a pagan priestess, well, then to the eyes of the crazy Christian, then you were a witch. I understand that. I get that. I also get reclaiming the word, like reclaiming the word fag and gay and things like that, like or queer. Queer is a power word to me. I use that word all the time. Reclaim my otherness, my magical self. The word witch. That's great. Alice, reclaim the devil. You know.
Right.
There's a question real quick. It's a good question in the chat. It says, hold on, I missed it. How has your understanding of the devil as witch father evolved from your first book to this new, your new understanding of the devil and the witches Sabbath?
I would say like it's evolved in the sense that like through my research into different Sabbath narratives, you really start to see a lot of the different various ways that the devil shows up, and you start to see a lot of the more like folkloric nuances of this character. You know, so you see what's interesting is you see a lot of variance. So you'll see accounts where like the devil, yes, seems like this sort of mean being, even to the witches. But then you also see these sort of like funny, almost goofy stories with later popular folklore. So just an example, I think one of the really, really funny stories, which comes out of the Swedish witch trials, is these accounts of how the devil was really concerned about whether or not the witches actually cared for him. And so he fakes his death. He pretends to die to kind of see their reactions. And when he sees that they're very sad and they're crying, he sort of pops up and is like, oh, I'm just kidding. I'm still alive. And so this really sort of breaks away from, I think, this kind of one-way narrative that like he's the source of all evil. You start to see him as more of this character. And I think within that characterization, we start to see different lessons that can be learned in different ways of engaging with spirits. So I think it's evolved in the sense that, you know, you see more of how this concept developed and how much more nuanced it is.
Well, how is this change your personal practice?
Mm-hmm.
In the chat, I'm like, oh, this is good.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about working with the devil is that it's really the first time that I've felt connected to a masculine sort of spirit or energy. Although I do think it's important to note too that the devil is also very non-binary. And is very prone to shifting between genders and gender identity and presentation and all of that. So, but yeah, I think it's the first time that I've felt connected to, you know, what we could term like a masculine presenting at times deity. Before that, I never really felt connected to that sort of energy. You know, there were times throughout, you know, my practice of witchcraft, where I've tried to form relationships with different male deities, and it just never really took. And then it just sort of came into my mind, this idea of the devil. And, as I'm reading more texts and learning more about traditional witchcraft, that I just couldn't get it out of my head. And I remember, sort of those first initial encounters, and like they were just really like soul shaking. And so my practice in that sense evolved, and was impacted by now, like I'm engaging with new spirits, with new energies.
For myself, and I know everyone has their own experiences and has their own, aha power moments and things, but I agree. I do follow several gods. I'm looking around my temple space, and I have like 18,000 deities over here. But, for me, especially the devil, witch father, however you view it, to me, because he's such an earthy, dark. When I mean dark, I don't mean scary. I just mean like earthy, primal presence. That for me, he is very tangible. Which some of the gods are very etheric and light and fluffy, whereas he's like earth, bone, and it feels like that. And it's easy, at least for me, it's easy to connect. It's easy to feel like, oh, I feel the presence. I have to laugh. I don't think Aaron was there last fall, here in Chicago. I did a circle out in the Forest Preserve, and we had a newer applicant, I guess you could say a dedicant, and we were calling up the spirits, and we call up the devil, and all of a sudden, like we're in trance, and all of a sudden, I hear, "Holy shit, he's actually here!" I laugh so hard because that's how traditional craft, at least for me, which is because you're so close to the earth, it can manifest easier. However, I've had other gods and spirits manifest too, but it was just that feeling, and they're there. Like, for example, it's not like I feel a nice presence. I feel the moon. No, it's like, oh my, I feel dread.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at Aaron. I feel dread. And so all of a sudden, I'm like, he's here. He's here. I'm not even thinking, he's here, because I want to run away and scream. That's how he's here. And it's very tangible,
Which, like, that makes me think of, so I had this experience many years ago, and this was before I had gotten into traditional witchcraft or even like thought of the possibility of working with the devil. And there was I had this idea that I was going to go into the woods behind my house, and I was going to spend the night in the woods. And my brilliant idea is that I would just sort of sleep in a sleeping bag. Like, I didn't need a tent. I didn't need that obviously did not go very well. This is during the summer and it was really, really hot. And so zipping yourself up completely in a sleeping bag is just not a great idea. But I'm sleeping out there and it's completely dark. And I start hearing these almost like hoofbeats. And as I'm listening to it, like in my mind, I just can't stop thinking about, like, this is not an animal on 4 legs. This is something on 2 legs, 2 hooves. And in my mind, I just see this image of like this devilish figure sort of dancing. And then I just got freaked out, which, like, even at the time, like, I was already, like, I don't want to say like nothing would scare me, but like, it's sort of odd looking back on it that I was so suddenly so frightened. And I ended up running home, and of course this is pitch black, like the moon's not out. So I'm running into trees and I'm scrambling through the forest. And so years later, like reading this folklore, like that's very akin to like a lot of sort of like folkloric, like initiatory first meetings with spirits and the devil, like this. And so it's just kind of this like moment of like, oh my gosh, like, whoa, that happened.
That's awesome. What do you think, Aaron?
It's hilarious. It's almost like one of those fairy tales about like the boy who knew no fear or something like that, and then you see him running home at the end of the story. I love that. A couple. I could throw out a couple random quick questions for sabbatic practice. Solitary or group ritual? What do you prefer?
For me, individual. I mean, I'm just a very like solitary person in general. So for me, it's most of my workings are geared more towards just me and the spirits.
Um, what do you feel about pre-recorded music while you are working?
What was that?
How do you feel about pre-recorded music while you're working?
I think it's great.
Yeah.
I think as long as long as you make sure that like I talk about this in the book, like make sure that like your music is going to play uninterrupted. So no ads are going to pop up, depending on what you're using, and then whatever device you're using is silenced in other capacities and out of the way, because it would just not be great to be doing that and be like super deep in it, and suddenly you get like some Spotify ad or like Facebook Messenger notifications start popping off. That would not be fun.
So I was just telling one of my, I have a student who's taking shamanism classes from me, and today in the class we were doing shamanism, but we grabbed the tarot and we did something else and we played some music from our phones, and she was laughing, and I said, listen, don't you think the witches and shamans, if they had the iPhones, they would use it, right?
Right.
I mean, granted, for me, one of the things I teach is that tools aren't for the spirit, tools are for us. And I am a hardcore believer. I love the witch aesthetic. I love the broom, the stain, the cauldron, the skull. I mean, I have tattoos of skulls on me and things like that. But I just like, and the reason I like it isn't because it's dark. It says witchcraft. It's because it's a stimulus for me. It brings to me a sense of trance, a sense of a connection to the spirits, to the gods, to the dead, things like that. And so, I mean, I think all those things are very important. So if you can still do that, you can have your pre-recorded music and have your, like people ask me all the time, because I teach classes on the dead and ancestors, do I have to have a real skull? I'm like, I don't even have a real skull. I use a ceramic or resin or whatever, clay, that works, whatever. All right, so it is about 9 p.m. And so do you have any, Kelden, do you have any closing words?
No, I would just say, kind of to circle back, I mean, I would just say to anyone who is curious or wants to experience the other world or the Sabbath, just know that it's within the realm of possibility. And you probably have already done those things, and maybe you just haven't even realized it.
Aaron, closing words.
Thank you so much for being here. I loved the book. I loved that it explained so many things that we already do, and gives a different explanation or brings in some lore that I forgot about. I love the research, and I'm so happy to talk to you today. Anybody wants to say hi, you can find me on Instagram. I'm Nightcap Test Oven, and because I'm a baker. And Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
I wanted to hold up a cover. I have it on the Kindle. Can you see it's a cool cover? Again, very well researched. I love the exercises. One of the things that we touched on a little bit was getting out of your body, shamanic journeying, astral projection. It's very simple. It's so simple. It's so easy. So, and it teaches you how to do it in the book. It's real simple. I love this book, and Aaron knows when it comes to tradcraft, I don't recommend a whole lot of books. I recommend this a lot, like a lot. So good job. And where can we find you on social media, Kelden?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram. That's probably the best place to find me. My user name is Kelden Mercury. You can also find me on YouTube under the same name. Those are the two primary places that you can find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Nikki. And again, my name is Chris Allen, Allau. And you can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, all Chris Allen. I make it real simple for people. I ever so often have people like, oh, what's your, do you have a handle? I was like, I don't even know what that means. What's a handle? But anyway, thank you everyone for coming, and we shall see you soon. Where is my recording button?